Hi, I'm Decoding Trolls. I was driving along in a former Soviet country today and I saw a sign for what they call the Fairy Tale Museum. And so I came into it. It's closed at the moment, but the people running it allowed me to come in and film this. It provoked the memory of the genesis of disinfolklore, which was an insight I had when I first arrived in eastern Ukraine in February 2015 to this magical place, which is now under Russian occupation, called Stanitsa Luhanska. And I had this insight from almost the first moment I was there that there was something folklore about the entire situation. And trying to understand what the aggregated parts of that perception were has led me on this amazing journey, which many of you have been with me on since February 2023, when I coined the word disinfolklore. So it took me 8 years to realize the disinfolklore element of this way of seeing reality. And so the way I saw Stanitsa Luhanska was by perceiving there was something folklore about the situation. Now I understand that that's a kind of reciprocal intuition. So it's coming from me. I'm perceiving Stanitsa Luhanska, Eastern Ukraine, the former Soviet bloc, these magical places from a nature point of view, but also with the remnants of what I remember first encountering in folktales and illustrations of folktales as a small child, and the reciprocity between me perceiving reality through folktale and folklore and folktale archetypes, and the actual marshalling of this in the space itself. So the great Ukrainian writer Victoria Amelina, who was executed by the Russians in 2023 in pizzeria in Kramatorsk with an Iskander missile, she wrote Shell Hole in a Fairy Tale, which was about a kindergarten in Stanitsa Luhanska, where I worked for 3 years. And one of the opening salvos in Russia's war of annihilation against Ukraine, the full-scale invasion in February 2022, was to send a shell. It was the Wagner military group corps of the Russian army, who was given the task of moving in from the Russian-occupied so-called Luhansk People's Republic across the bridge at Stanitsa Luhanska, where I worked between 2015 and 2018, and to try and capture all of Luhansk. And as we know, Russia has still failed to capture all of the eastern oblast of Luhansk. But one of its first salvos and its announcement of the war and the full-scale invasion was to send a shell into a kindergarten in Stanitsa Luhanska, which is located in this idyllic biosphere reserve where I first had the intuition that there was something folklore about the entire situation I found myself in there, and indeed about the Russian occupation of part of Ukraine. And they sent a shell into this kindergarten, which was called the Færy Tale Kindergarten. And I'll post a photograph with this post of the shell hole in the fairy tale, which appeared on the front page of the New York Times. So that was 7 years after I first arrived in Stanitsa Luhanska and had this intuition about folklore and fairy tales. And having spent the last 8-9 years exploring this intuition and having developed the disinfolklore analytical method, I now see the depth of this insight extends way far beyond the use of folkloric tropes and archetypes in what I today call disinfolklore, which is a narrative form that is perfected by the Russian occupiers in eastern Ukraine, rolled out then across the whole of Russia since the full-scale invasion, and also used by MAGA in the United States to create an entirely internally coherent system of storytelling and tropes and archetypes, which are meaningless to many of us who are not involved in it. And I caution anyone who is operating in this space that I'm operating in, which is to try and interpret and understand how our minds are being manipulated and how these distant folk, what I today call distant folklore galaxies, are being wrought of millions of concatenating, manipulative, psychologically manipulative, gamified stories and storytelling, which in fact create a whole system within which we operate. And it's not only is it very difficult to escape these distant folklore wrought galaxies and systems, as any of us who have been unfortunate enough to know someone who completely normal, completely clever, intelligent, bright, has fallen into the MAGA distant folklore universe, or indeed anyone who's fallen into the Russian distant folklore universe, which they are desperately trying to wrap around humanity and around Europe. And they have succeeded in convincing some people that the logic, the provocation logic cycle, that NATO expansion, this myth about NATO expansion, provoked Russia into occupying Ukraine and killing hundreds of thousands of native Russian language-speaking Ukrainians because they decided to save them. So many people have fallen for this troll that we know. And it's very hard for any of us to actually see from outside it, to step outside the doors of perception, as it were, and see what is going on, that this is a completely inorganic MAGA distant folklore galaxy, or a completely inorganic distant folklore galaxy inside Russia-occupied Ukraine. So this insight, which I had in February 2015, that there was something folklore about the situation, has mushroomed or unfurled into a whole theory of cognition. I realized that it is that the identity between the actual setting in that biosphere reserve, which is a river, the Donets River, a river known since antiquity, over which willows hung, a biosphere reserve where wild animals were running and often set off mines in the areas where I was patrolling as a monitoring officer for the international community. The identity between that scene where villages and houses all had wells, like the kinds of wells you would see in the illustrations accompanying folk tales and fairy tales if you grew up in Western Europe or America around the time that I did, and grew up on a diet of folk tales and Disney stories and fairy tales, that the identity of the actual environment, the natural environment, with the archetypes given to us as children, usually when we were seeing, was so close that it was impossible for me not to see the continuities between the folktale genre of stories, or the fairy tale genre of stories, and this actual forested environment we're in. And I've written extensively on the mother and the maiden archetype, which helped lead me towards understanding how Russian and MAGA distant folklore uses archetypes to embed ideas in our minds. And these archetypes could be what Carl Jung described as the primordial archetypes of the mother and the maiden, for instance. So in this story that I encountered in around April 2016, when I was sent on a tasking by my boss, which had been set by the Russian intelligence services in Russia-occupied Ukraine, where they had spun this story to my boss that a mother and an underage daughter were about to be chopped into tiny pieces by a Ukrainian Nazi, and we were sent, me and my colleagues were sent into forest to a cottage where the mother and the maiden lived. And this, at the time, I didn't understand that the mother and the maiden are primordial archetypes. So that was quite so obvious, just like the identity between the environment in Stanitsa Luhanska and the environment of folk tales and fairy tales was so obviously close to the environments that I encountered as a child reading stories in, say, Ladybird renderings of folk tales and fairy tales or the Brothers Grimm stories, that it was impossible not to see it. What is much harder to see is when we're reading news, what I call distant folklore, this narrative form, which will use stories whose settings are set in the same setting of other news. So the myth will be woven that Ukraine, for instance, shelled this or that place. And so it's very hard to see in that the same idea of folktales. But what they're trying to embed there is the idea that Ukraine deserves to be genocided, that Ukrainians deserve to be killed, and that Russia is actually rescuing a damsel in distress. And so this initial insight from Stanitsa Luhanska led me towards, over the course of years, to understanding that precisely what Disney uses, or what now MAGA uses, and what the Russian occupiers used to create in the minds of the consumers of distant folklore, these folklore-born archetypes, extended into what we would normally think of as news, the news space. And it's harder to see it there because it's not there. These stories aren't set in forested places with willows hanging over trees, and with old ladies who are very kindly offering people bread, and little children escaping from bears and wolves and all of that stuff. But the structure of those tales is immanent in the news which is being conveyed to us, and it enters our minds and manipulates our minds using the same archetypal structures that we learn or imbibe through the folk tales we encountered as children. And because my eyes were tuned into this use of folk tales and fairy tales, so for instance, the kindergarten in Stanitsa Luhanska had been called the Færy Tale kindergarten, and the Russians choosing to send a shell into it. Who knows what they thought they would achieve by it, but it was a very purposeful and purposive action, and it appeared on the front pages of newspapers all around the world. Of course, when I first encountered the Færy Tale kindergarten in Stanitsa Luhanska in 2015, I never imagined for a second it would play a starring role in the first stage of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine some 7 years later. And indeed, that the aspect of cognition and the aspect of Russians' way of seeing the world through folktale and fairy tale archetypes would lead them to choose and select this particular spot, this particular institution, a kindergarten called the Færy Tale. And then this great Ukrainian writer, who the Russians would send a whole missile to execute and kill many other people, including twin children in the pizzeria in central Kramatorsk, after she published this story, Shell Hole in a Fairy Tale, becomes all part of the distant folklore content which the Russians then use. So they bomb the kindergarten with a shell. Then Victoria Amelina writes about this and publishes about this. Then Russia uses a missile to execute this female Ukrainian writer. And then Russia broadcasts its own distant folklore to say, oh, actually, we weren't trying to kill this writer. We were trying to kill Ukrainian military service people in a pizzeria in Kramatorsk that day. And so the Ukrainians deserved this, and this was somehow justified. This is spun into the minds of Russians, and indeed into some Westerners who who would fall for such trolls. And it becomes a whole system where the Russians' activities in Ukraine, their kinetic activities, their bombings, the writing about them, either by Ukrainians or by Russians on Telegram to try and scare Ukrainians, to try and scare us into surrendering Ukraine to the Russians, to the big bad wolf, are then spun by the Russians as stories. And so that is just one cycle of a story. The shell hole in the fairy tale, Victoria Amelina, then they execute her with a missile, then they publish folklore about this. And what we have is millions of folklore story cycles like that, coiled up, wrapped around each other like triple, infinite, triple, double helixes in our information space surrounding us, so that our entire mode of perceiving reality, which initially we gain through our parents and through reading folk tales and fairy tales, through having read to us as small children, this is substituted. This becomes like a jumping off point for an entirely new mode of reality, which is created around us, which the folklore analytical method that I've invented enables us to perceive, because otherwise we are just turning on the news each day, and it is manipulating our moods, our attitudes, our intentions, and our motivations. These four elements of our perception of our being are consciously manipulated. Our energy, our mana, is consciously, purposefully manipulated. It's shaken. Its own mana is pulated. It's moved up and down by these stories, by these elements of folklore galaxies, by these cycles, like that cycle I just said to you. But of course, we've got millions of these cycles, all building one on top of the other, often repeating. So we see repetition in MAGA folklore in America. We see in 2016, the Republican Party dropped the commitment to arm Ukraine in its manifesto. This was brought about by a guy called Paul Manafort, who had been funded by pro-Russia oligarchs for 10 years in Ukraine to divide Ukraine and to bring to preeminence and to power a pro-Russia, anti-European leader. This guy, Paul Manafort, then runs away from Ukraine in February 2014 after his boss runs away from Ukraine, the then president of Ukraine, who was later impeached. And then Manafort pops up in public awareness again as Donald Trump's campaign manager in the summer of 2016, and he causes the Republican Party, and I have the email, I'll post it in this podcast. He causes the Republican Party to drop their commitment to arming Ukraine, which is a commitment the Republican Party and the American right, conservative right, had always had, which was to help the enemies of Russia. And suddenly this is dropped. Then a couple of years later, Donald Trump gets impeached for holding back weapons for Ukraine. Then flash forward to the present, we've got Paul Manafort, who's advising. He's been jailed in the interim for acting as an unregistered foreign agent for Ukraine for the pro-Russian president of Ukraine at the time. And now he's advising Donald Trump again, and Donald Trump again is withholding weapons from Ukraine. So we see these characters, these same structures popping up again and again. And obviously that's just one of thousands I could reel off, which the Russians, for instance, can constantly play up, for instance, about President Zelensky's so-called illegitimacy. So these pop up again and again in our information space as elements of folklore. And if you get your eye in, if you understand what the folklore analytical method is, it uses the insights that we as small children gained from learning about the world and our environment, about storytelling through folk tales and fairy tales, through Disney, through Ladybird, through reading the Brothers Grimm. It uses insights from there and applies them to the news, to the distant folklore apparatus surrounding us, which is constantly spewing out stories with certain structures within them that have archetypes in them. Sometimes they're extremely obvious archetypes, the mother and the maiden, like in that story I just told. Other times, it's a bit harder to see. And the distant folklore analytical method, which I've invented, enables us to see it and archetype these stories as elements of distant folklore and elements in the distant folklore galaxy. It enables us to perceive the reality which is being woven around us as constituting many, many, many different stories, distant folklore, which are quite purposefully being wrought to wrap our minds up in an artificial, inorganic form of reality. And if you can think of someone you know who has fallen into the MAGA cult, you will understand they live in a completely alternative reality universe, as indeed do Russians today. They did not always live inside this reality. And in fact, even Ukrainians had a hope at the beginning of the full-scale invasion that simply by revealing the truth of the invasion, they could wake them up from their slumber. It's the Sleeping Beauty tale, where an entire kingdom is put into a slumber, is a perfect metaphor for what Russian distant folklore apparatus, which was perfected in this area just across the river, across the Donets River, where I worked for 3 years as one of the few Westerners ever to work in Russia-occupied Ukraine. I had the benefit of being enmeshed in one of the first distant folklore galaxies that was ever created. Now we see MAGA using the same techniques has created a similar distant folklore galaxy inside the minds of the MAGA cult members in America, and inside a huge number of Americans who have no sympathy for MAGA, but they are just being tossed and turned every day by these crazy stories which are being wrought around them and broadcast around them through the media, through the Fox News, and notice Fox is an element from folklore and from folk tales as well. The fox is a perennial character in folklore through Fox News, but also through your best friend or your mother or your cousin or your godmother or your godfather. Your Ivy League educated godparents may have gone MAGA, because that is the power of it. And now some of the symptoms of the MAGA distant folklore cult membership, which were obviously MAGA, are imminent in ordinary Americans who are not MAGA adjacent and not even sympathetic to MAGA. They're fallen to the troll. They cannot see, for instance, that their minds have been quite purposefully and consciously manipulating into accepting a mode of governance and a type of governance that 5 years ago, if you'd said to them, this is what you're going to support, they would have laughed at you. But this is what distant folklore does. It manipulates our minds, and it is generated from the ingredients of folk tales and the fairy tales which we read as children, and stories like Tolkien. So we see Palantir, which is this company which is basically a company owned by one of the PayPal mafia, or begun by them, which was the origin story appears to be after it was discovered that after the Second Gulf War, the collection of intelligence on Americans was illegal and had been made illegal. So the government couldn't do it. And so this was outsourced to this company, Palantir, which has created this amazing structure where it collects vast amounts of data and has the computing power to interpret it using the neural network algorithms that have been created out of the offspring of PayPal. So PayPal, when it was floated, it made a number of people who are collectively known as the PayPal Mafia extremely rich, who then reinvested that money through venture capital funds in Silicon Valley and Santa Clara County. And that money is what funded Google and Facebook and some of these huge internet companies, which created the first non-toy size, bigger than toy size, neural network algorithms. And over the space of 10 years, computer vision and semantic structuring, automated semantic structuring of language. We have Google Translate, for instance, as one retail product of it. But these tools are dependent on neural network algorithms, which is a vast aggregation of unimaginably huge computing power that companies now like Palantir can use to crunch all the data. So now, for instance, they have, since all the social security data for every American is now inside these computing systems and is being crunched and turned into actionable intelligence for the government and for the people that Donald has put into place, that the PayPal Mafia has put into place. And Distant Folklore can be designed perfectly to perfectly match the minds and intelligences and emotional structures of the people. So this is the reality we're living in today. But Palantir gets its name from Tolkien, from these magic stones. So the distant folklore analytical method is predictive in a way. Once you get your eye in, you begin to see how it's not just the Russians doing it, or not just MAGA using bogeymen, trans, migrants, and these troll tales, the archetypal troll tale of three billy goats gruff, where three billy goats, who are the original migrants, want to cross a bridge over a river like the Donets River, where I worked between 2015 and 2018 in eastern Ukraine, just to get a bit of extra food. And the troll, the first goat, crosses and meets a troll guarding the bridge, and he says, I just want to go across and have some food. So this is the tale of all economic migrants. But the next billy goat coming is much bigger than me, so don't kill me, let me go. And the troll allows them to go, and then the second billy goat says the same thing, and then the third billy goat says the same thing but kills the troll, and then three billy goats cross the river and go into this new land as the migrants. So this archetypal tale was imminent in the first moments of Donald Trump's campaign in 2016, when he talked about the migrants, the criminal, the rapists coming, excuse me for using that word, but he did use it, the criminal rapists coming from Mexico, which is this idea of threatening the sovereignty, the security, and the fertility. This is the importance of the sexual crimes, the fertility of the inner realm. So these are the three billy goats coming from Mexico into the inner realm of America. And Donald is situating, is archetyping himself as protecting it. And this, of course, is exactly the same archetypal structure that the Russians use and that Vladimir Putin used on the 20th of February 2022, when he used a folk song from metal, from Soviet folk culture, from a metal band called Red Mold, Sleeping Beauty in a Coffin. So Sleeping Beauty, again, another archetypal fairy tale. And when Putin announced that he was saying to Ukraine, "Take it, my beauty," and he was referencing this very vulgar song, which describes a necrophiliac rape which features in this Soviet-era hard rock song called Sleeping Beauty in a Coffin. And international lawyers looking for the intention to genocide the Ukrainians in the minds of the Russian leadership cite this reference by Vladimir Putin, this folkloric trope. So it's folkloric in the sense of it's part of Soviet-era folklore, this metal band, but it's also itself riffing off archetypal folktale, Sleeping Beauty in a Coffin. It's archetyping Ukraine as a woman and as a dead woman as a corpse who will be defiled, whether she likes it or not. Take it, my beauty, by Russia. And so this is the archetyping of Ukraine as a woman, as a corpse, who will be annihilated by Russia. Of course, those of us who have followed closely the war, and if you follow distant folklore, you'll be following the war as closely as me, understand the war hasn't turned out, hasn't had the fairy tale ending that the Russians hoped it would. Yet they still do believe in this fairy tale ending from their perspective. Their mode of cognition is so twisted that they think no matter how much, and this is the essence of magical thinking, which contaminates their minds, they think that no matter how awful they behave, in the end, they will prevail. But of course, those of us who are supporting Ukraine and who understand where we are in the war at the moment, I think are very confident that it will be a happy ending for Ukraine, but not for the Russians. But this mode of cognition for the Russians is, and the Russians' leadership, because since I've had my eye in by looking at distant folklore and how we perceive reality and geopolitics through folkloric tropes, through, for instance, Don't Poke the Bear, or the Lavrov, the current foreign minister of Russia, constantly references folk tales to explain how, so for instance, he recently talked about how the Russian measures 8 times and cuts once. He's referencing a proverb. And I counter that with counter-distant folklore by saying, no, anyone who's watched the war will understand the average Russian will cut 7 times and never get around to measuring. So we can, once we perceive how they are perceiving the world through folk tales, we can counter their distant folklore, their mental manipulations, with counter-distant folklore, which also consciously takes archetypes, which they use, and subverts them and throws them back at them. And so we can design our distant folklore, our counter-distant folklore, to counter MAGA Russian and other forms of distant folklore quite consciously. Once we're aware that this is how their manipulative stories works. So from this place, this fairy tale museum, which I'm not going to bring you around because I don't have a thing for my phone camera, but take it from me, I'm in this fairy tale museum, which for me is more evidence that the Soviet mindset perceived the world through the lenses of folklore. And they are to this day attempting, as Donald is, and as Palantir is, they are attempting to subvert all our lenses. So we see the world through this magical thinking, through these magical stories about a reality which, frankly speaking, doesn't benefit ordinary people like you and me. It may benefit billionaires. They may even think it benefits them and not benefit them in the end. But either way, it's important for us to understand what they are up to, how they're mentally manipulating us. And that's what my entire Distant Folklore project is about. And I'm really happy that you're here and that you're listening and that you pay attention to the things I write. I constantly think about it, constantly computing the data through the lenses of distant folklore and constantly evolving it to match the new realities as it is evolving, because this is the fight of our lives. If we surrender our world and surrender our perception to these distant folklore weaving ne'er-do-wells, then we will have the worst world. We will have the nightmare world of our worst fairy tales and our worst folk tales. I don't believe that's inevitable. And I think we can, each of us individually has an impact on culture. Our culture is a function of what we do. And yes, there are people like Peter Thiel or Donald Trump or Putin who have vast distant folklore propagation apparatuses around them. and vast numbers of extremely creative, brilliant people who are trying to turn our world into a world of death and darkness and misery. But on the other side, there's people like you and me, ordinary people, who have a role to play and to assert our own power to affect the culture in which we're embedded, in which we live, and to determine our own futures. So we do determine our own futures. We determine the social circumstances in which we live, and that is the mission of Distant Folklore as a project, the Distant Folklore analytical method, which enables us to see the Distant Folklore narrative form that I spotted for the first time. And this is the embedded archetypes in data, whether that data is obviously about fairy tales or folk tales in a Disney film or a Grimm's fairy tale, or much harder to see that that's what's going on because it's in the news, it's being read to you by the BBC or by Fox News. But either way, what we're trying to do is empower us to perceive when our moods, our attitudes, our intentions, and our motivations are purposefully manipulated so that we enter, we start to read a newspaper article thinking we want to support Ukraine, for instance, or support this cause. But by the end of it, we're led to believe it's hopeless. So we support another cause, or we don't do anything. We don't take action. We just sit back and go, oh, the world is terrible. That's not what Distant Folklore is about. Distant Folklore is about empowerment through perception of reality through the lenses of Distant Folklore, and by applying the Distant Folklore analytical method. And I'm so happy you're with me on this journey, because it is a journey, and it will continue, believe me, for many years to come. And thank you.